So this A-level English language video is all about language diversity, and it's the fifth and final video about language occupation and power. Okay, and I wanted to start off by reminding you about the architecture of the AQA A-level course and how in paper 2 there are two different areas where actually you could be writing about language occupation and power, because you've got your section A, which is your evaluative essay. Okay, and you have a choice in the exam. It's an either or without data. So one is a language diversity topic, the other one is a language change topic. But then in section B, you've got your language discourses. Now this is where you get thrown at you two pieces of journalism on a similar topic, similar linguistic topic. And what you have to do in the exam is to spend an hour analysing and comparing those two pieces of language. So how are the journalists using language in order to try and make you think and feel in certain ways? How are they shaping your responses? So you do that for an hour, and then you create your own opinion article. So you do your own piece of journalism that's on the same topic. Okay, so all the stuff that we've been doing in the previous videos about language and occupation is getting you ready not only for an evaluative essay, but also this kind of section B language discourses task as well. Okay, so in the next slides, I'm going to show you the beginnings of two articles which are about a language occupational topic, jargon. So you're going to read these openings and you're going to be thinking about, well, how do the articles use language to present viewpoints about the uses of jargon? Now, here's a kind of checklist, and this is not exclusive. There are other things perhaps you need to think about, but these are some of the most common areas that you need to be picking apart in these openings. First of all, the headlines, because of course publications go to a lot of trouble crafting their headlines to use language in the most interesting ways. So you need to think, what are they doing here with the headlines? How are they trying to position their audience? Perhaps there are things like pragmatic references, like cultural allusions or intertextual references to other texts. Maybe there are phonological elements going on there, things like onomatopoeia or alliteration. Maybe there is some kind of wordplay or ambiguity. So really try and pull apart the headlines and what are they trying to say. Look also at the opening sentences, right? Opening sentences are very interesting because the journalist is trying to pull you into the shop. So there you are standing at the window and you're looking in the shop window, and the opening sentence is going to decide, is that person going to go on and read the article? So quite often you get things like anecdotes or startling statistics or jokes. There is something interesting usually going on in successful first sentences of articles. You need to think also about what references to real life examples that you've got and how your opinion as a reader is being shaped and moulded and positioned by the way that reality has been represented. Yeah. From a grammatical point of view, look at sentences. So look at sentence length, so short, lengthy, medium-sized sentences, but perhaps more importantly, look at things like sentence functions, by which I mean the relative proportion of things like declaratives, imperatives, exclamatives, and interrogatives. So are they all statements that we've got, or do we have some questions, or do we have some commands, etc.? And a lot of those things, if you've got a variety, they will certainly create a sense of direct address, that the writer is trying to create the impression that even though they're writing, they're actually talking to you. So look at your sentence features. There may also be scope there in sentences to be looking at sentence types, like are they minor sentences being used, or are they compound or complex or simple? Pronouns are always worth looking at in texts, because maybe you've got first person singular pronouns like I, me and my, in which case anecdotal personalised information is being brought to the table. Maybe you've got first person plural pronouns like we, us and our, in which case it's inclusive, it's collective, it's including you, the reader, into that writer's experiences. Or maybe it's second person pronouns, you. So look at the pronoun usage. Look also at modifiers, and particularly the use of adjectives and adverbs. So look, for example, at pre-modifiers, pre-modifying adjectives and adverbs. When you get to the noun, how is your judgment about that noun being coloured by the use of the pre-modifying modifiers? And then you've got paragraphing as well. So how has the information been broken down structurally in terms of the paragraphs? Okay, let's have a look at the openings of these two articles and see what points we can make. The perils of jargon, a plea to speak in plain English. Okay, so it's an interesting headline, isn't it? And we've got these extreme hyperbolic terms being used. Perils, meaning, dangers or risks. So that's quite an interesting use of language. We've also got consonants, because we've got the repetition of the plosive p and l labial sounds. Perils, please, and plain. So even though we may not be reading out aloud the headline to somebody else, still phonology plays its part. Okay, so this seems to be somebody who is criticising people's use of, very technical, precise, jargonistic language. Let's see if that actually emerges. That's gone into the wrong place. Okay. The road sign blocking my route across West London simply read reinstatement. Now that's interesting, isn't it? We've got an anecdote at the beginning here, and so it's a kind of everyday occurrence. Presumably the people reading this may well have come across some kind of similar kind of predicament. Okay, so it starts in a personalised way with a bit of anecdotal evidence. Of what or whom was anyone's guess, as with all government notices, customs forms, or indeed anything penned by petty bureaucrats, it made about as much sense as a box of hair. Okay. It's interesting, isn't it? So we've got these rhetorical devices being used. We've got a group of three here. Government notices, customs forms, anything penned by petty bureaucrats. So she's bunging together a whole load of different texts, and she's making a very extreme hyperbolic statement. She's saying anything produced by these three groups of people is nonsensical. Okay, so it's heavily pejorative, and she uses humour, because she uses a simile there where she's describing, the nonsense of these texts making as much sense as a box of hair. So you've got a startling kind of metaphor that's being used at the end of the sentence. Willfully ambiguous, the sign was also pompous enough to be amusing. Okay, so she's saying two things there. Willfully ambiguous. Willfully means on purpose. So the sign had been put up there purposefully not to make very much sense. And secondly, the language that's being used is pompous, and therefore it's funny. It's funny because it's pompous. And if the writing of it made some grey-faced, grey-suited little Jobsworth puff out his chest at his grey formica desk, bully for him. Again, we've got this use of repetition in the group of three, because you've got the repetitions of grey here, grey-faced, grey-suited, and grey formica. Okay, so it's obviously being presented in a very negative way. Notice the conversational style we've got, so the sentence begins with a coordinated connected and. Okay, and it's using a kind of idiomatic expression at the end of the paragraph, bully for him. Okay, so there's lots of humour that's going on, but it seems quite a strong, negatively pejorative representation about anybody who might be deemed to be using jargon. Our increasing tendency towards linguistic obfuscation becomes distinctly unamusing, however, when critical, life-changing documents, like social workers' reports, are so badly and bombastically written as to be incomprehensible to all concerned. So there's a slight change in tone here, because we've had the humour of the first paragraph, but then we've got a contrast in the second paragraph that's saying, well, it's funny enough, these sorts of situations where people are pompously and ambiguously using jargon, but it actually matters. It actually matters in certain sorts of areas when we've got life-changing moments, where we've got social workers' reports. Notice the way that the writer uses words like obfuscation. which in itself is a kind of difficult word to break down, meaning clouding. So here she's demonstrating that it's something that she's actually complaining about. So she herself is using kind of quite cloudy language in order to describe something that she's being critical of. Okay, look at the use of the modifiers badly and bombastically. By the time that we get to the end of the paragraph, we are being steered to think in a very, very negative way about anybody who is perceived to be using jargon. Okay, text number 2. Writers should not fear jargon. Researchers use complex language for a specific purpose, and science writers should be clear about what those reasons are, says Trevor Quirk. Okay, so here we've got quite a strident, strong headline that's being used, not least because we've got a deontic modal auxiliary verb should. So we see a very clear viewpoint coming through here. So just as in the previous article, there was a very clear stance and the audience was being positioned to feel in a very negative way about jargon. Here we're going to have the antithesis of this. We're going to have an alternate argument. And here we've got the byline. Researchers use complex language for a specific purpose, and science writers should be clear about what those reasons are. So here is somebody who is trying to show the reasons why complex language is being used. Okay, and the focus here is on science writers. Okay, so again, we've got this use of should, so it seems quite didactic. It seems like this writer is somebody who's trying to teach the general reader something. Who needs jargon? It's a great opening, isn't it? Remember what I said about the openings to articles? It sounds like, somebody who's dismissing jargon. Who needs jargon? Because it's the kind of idiomatic expression that all of us use at some point. And really, what he's going to go on to argue in the rest of the article is that we do need jargon. So it's an interesting start. Last month, a physics PhD student at the University of Innsbruck, Austria, won a competition to explain the concept of a flame in words that an 11-year-old could understand. Ben Ames, the winner, made a 7.5-minute video which introduced words as oxidation and pyrolysis only to parody them. Okay, so we've got some very precise information here, which gives us the feeling that we are in safe hands. This is somebody that's writing in an influential way because they seem to know their onions. They seem to know about this, about the PhD student at the University of Innsbruck. And what it seems to be demonstrating is here we've got somebody who is deliberately not using any jargon. And when they come across jargonistic words like oxidation, then actually they're mocking them because it says only to parody them. The very premise of this contest speaks to the aversion we science writers have for jargon. Many seem to assume that the pompous, sterile language of scientific literature has been designed to prevent our understanding of it. Reading the stuff seems like a kind of sadistic chore. Translating it, unspeakable. So, you can imagine the unpopularity of my belief that jargon is not only integral to scientific discourse, but also has a place in public discussion. Okay, so this is an interesting paragraph, not least because of the use of the pronouns. Notice the use of the first person plural pronoun, we there, and our over there. So here he is, he's including the reader in his own discourse community. And he's trying to pinpoint some of the criticisms that people make about scientific literature. And here he seems to be putting forward the counter-argument. These are the sorts of complaints that people have about jargon. And notice the way that he uses minor sentences here. So non-standard sentences are used in a very elliptical way to give the flavour of somebody just dismissing jargon out of hand without maybe thinking properly about it. Okay, so when you get to the end, it's quite a surprise that he's actually not going to be agreeing with this condemnation of jargon, but quite the opposite. He says that it's a really, really important part of scientific discourse, And also it's got its place not only in the science world, but in public discussion as well. So it's an interesting formulation of an argument. Okay, so those are just the beginnings of those two articles. There's the question that you would have in a real exam. You'd have the complete articles, and it would say, analyse and compare how the writers of text A and text B have used language to present viewpoints about the uses of jargon. If you're constructing an essay here, you'd want to build it around some really good topic sentences. So here I'm giving you some examples of topic sentences that you use, which are all comparative. The headlines both use dramatic language for different purposes. Now that's a perfect topic sentence because it's doing comparison properly. It's saying there's similarity between the headlines, but it's also saying there's difference as well for different purposes. The opening paragraphs approach the topic of jargon in different ways. Both articles contain references to real-life examples to illustrate different ideas. Both writers vary their sentence lengths and forms to argue their ideas about jargon. So that's where you could be talking about, things like the non-standard sentences that we saw in the last one, or the use of questions as well. The writers use pronouns in contrasting ways to position themselves and their readers. So that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because on the first one, you could talk about the first person singular pronouns, where she's producing anecdotal evidence. And in that second one, you could talk about the use of the first person plural pronouns, where he's talking about we, us, and our as members of a discourse community. Excuse me, my lights went off. What else have we got? Both writers use modifiers to influence the reader's response. Now we're talking about adverbs and adjectives. And finally, the texts are structured into paragraphs in different ways to appeal to their readers. So the secret on this is to make sure that you've got some really good topic sentences at the beginnings of paragraphs. And I would learn these. I'm not saying that you would be able to use all of these in every answer that you do, but in each piece that you look at, there's going to be interesting things going on with the headlines in the opening paragraphs or opening sentences, the sentence forms, the pronouns, the modifiers. There will be things to say about the structure of the paragraphs. That gives you a pretty effective checklist for your question 3. And you're going to be using the language of comparison all the way through, not just in your topic sentences, but within your paragraphs as well. So here we've got the lexicon of similarity, likewise, equally, just as, so both in the same way. So we've got the lexicon of similarity, and then we've got the lexicon of difference over here. Words like however, in contrast. On the other hand, whereas, don't start sentences with whereas, use it in the middle of the sentence. And get the spelling right. It's one word, whereas or alternatively. Okay, so embed those comparative words into your response to question 3. And then you've got question 4, where you have to write an opinion article. There's the question. Write an opinion article about jargon in which you assess the ideas and issues raised in the 2 articles. You should refer to ideas from language study and argue your own views. Now, it's very important that you look at this because this gets a mark out of 30. 2/3 of the mark are for concepts and theories. So although you're putting forward your own point of view, it's a piece of journalism, you have to demonstrate all of the knowledge that you learnt on the course, concepts and theories. Okay, and only 1/3 of the mark is actually for creativity. So the way to start on this is to make a list. Is to make a list of all the AO2 ideas that you think you're going to be including. And also when you're writing it, do bear in mind that your reader is not a specialist, supposedly. The implied reader they're a non-specialist. That doesn't mean to say that you have to dumb down what you're doing, but it's just that they're not an A-level English language student. So you will need to do some kind of glossing of particular terms. So what I'd encourage you to do is write down some of the generic features of a magazine article that you're going to be doing that make it different from the style of an academic essay. Here are some of these features. So as on the articles, you need to start with an arresting and engaging headline and byline. Notice the difference between the two. The byline has your name in it. I'll give you an example of one in a few minutes. You then need some kind of engaging opening sentence and opening paragraph, because if your first paragraph is boring, then your article is going to be very unsuccessful. You need a variety in paragraph lengths. So do that thing that presumably your GCSE English teacher told you to do for writing in the exam when you were doing descriptive writing. Occasionally throw in something like a one-sentence paragraph. Okay, so vary your paragraph length and also vary your sentence types and functions. So don't just do boring declaratives all the way through. Ask questions, throw in imperatives, and maybe at times do exclamatives as well. And of course, vary your sentence length as well. So sometimes long, sometimes medium, sometimes very short. So variety is very important. You're trying to do this thing called synthetic personalization. You're trying to create the illusion of a relationship between you and the reader. So you're shaping and positioning the audience's response. You're not just relaying a whole load of information, you're trying to get your reader to think and feel in a certain way. You will have some kind of cultural references presumably going on in your article, some kind of pragmatic references. Incidentally, you need to be referring back to these articles that you're responding to, but don't necessarily assume that the reader has read the two articles. So there needs to be some kind of reference to those articles and some kind of explanation about what the writers were saying before you deconstruct their arguments. You need a range of really interesting vocabulary, so always think of synonyms. If, for example, you've used the word language in one sentence, in the next sentence, try and think of an alternative, like the word lingo, for example. And you're going to need cohesion. So at a structural level, you're going to need cataphoria, which is references to things which are going to be explained better later on. And then you're going to have anaphoria, which is reference to things backwards. So you're going to create that sense of structure through cataphoria and anaphoria. And think of your ending as well. The best way to do an ending is to take your reader back to the headline or the opening to your article. That way, the reader is going to feel, I've come full circle with this piece. I started with that, and now I'm back at the beginning. Okay, so what AO2 knowledge are you going to put in this article? Here are some suggestions. You might be wanting to be discussing about Fairclough's differentiation between instrumental and influential power, okay, because one of the complaints against jargon is that it's people who are trying to, exert instrumental power over people in an unfair way by using language that nobody can understand. So that might be useful. You've also got the material that we covered in a previous video about the power of exclusive language, where you've got Spolsky and Holmes and Stubbs. You've also got the notion of codes and cryptolects, that although language is this way that we have of kind of converging and linking with people, quite often we use language in order to exclude groups of people as well, not to be understood by certain people. We have certain restricted occupational lexis, which you will have studied about. So we looked at the language of teaching. We looked in a previous video at the language of minors and of the language of the law. There may be an argument for you to be introducing information about the Plain English campaign, which was set up in the late 1970s in order to restrict the amount of jargon that's out there in public life. And then you could be thinking about discourse communities. So what constitutes discourse communities and some of the features of talk at work. There was research done in the previous video about Drew and heritage. And maybe, again, you want to be drawing upon Howard Giles' notion of accommodation theory. Okay, this is people's natural tendency to want to converge with each other, or in certain circumstances, to diverge from people too. So if I were writing this article about jargon and occupational language, I probably would be wanting to include those sorts of things for my AO2. Here's me doing an example. Turning the jargon off. Not brilliant, I know, but it's using some kind of wordplay there with the contrast between on and off. And it's trying to neatly summarise what the article is about. Should we be using jargon or not? Paul Heselton argues that complaints about others' jargon are understandable, but often misguided. Now that is a byline. You see how completely different the byline is to the headline. Your byline has your name in it, and it succinctly summarises what your article is all about. And here what I've tried to show is that it's a well-balanced kind of argument that I'm doing, and I'm not just going to senselessly dismiss occupational jargon, but I'm going to put forward an argument about it. Of course, AO1 and AO2 both need bolstering in the next NEA. My wife and I both nodded vigorously. Neither of us had any idea what my son's history teacher might mean by this mysterious combination of letters and numbers. It certainly sounded impressive, but, like much of the educational jargon served up for us at the Year 10 Parents' Evening, it seemed more designed to bemuse than enlighten. Right, so there you got your opening, and it's an anecdotal opening. I've just made it up. I didn't go to Parents' Evening where the teacher actually said that. I've made it up. And so this is your opportunity to do this level of convincing creative writing, where you're using an supposed anecdotal experience here to introduce the topic of jargon in public. The linguist Norman Fairclough noted how the use of jargon in public situations is all about power. Jargon, a Norman French borrowed word with the literal meaning of the twittering of birds, is a supreme demonstration of this power play. Now, boom, you see straight away here how we're moving into AO2. So we've got the introduction of Norman Fairclough, and the point about Norman Fairclough interprets jargonistic use as being to do with power. We've got some knowledge here because there's an information about the etymological roots of the word jargon and what it meant. Okay, so immediately we're on the board here. We're scoring points for AO2, which remember is 2/3 of the mark. It is sometimes argued that this highly specialised coded language used by social workers, magistrates, insurance companies and the like is deliberately designed to exclude and indeed mislead the outsider. Jargon, it is said, is the current day Polari, the homosexual language heard in swinging 60s London, a secret language or cryptolect used to mystify those not in the know. An older comparison might be the Cockney rhyming slang of the East End streets of the 1830s, a lingo created by petty thieves to escape detection by the world's first newly established police force. The bobbies on the beat might have had decisive instrumental power, but the canny pickpockets had the power of jargon on their side. Would you Adam and Eve it? So here we're properly getting into gear here with AO2. We're noticing that this is not written like an essay. It is written like a piece of journalism, and therefore you need that snappy, brisk, humorous journalistic style. But at the same time, you've got to be conveying that you know your onions in terms of AO2 language. You know, for example, about Polari. Or at least you will know about it when we study that bit of the course. So here we've got information about Polari. We've also got information about Cockney rhyming slang. And they're both being used because they're examples of coded language. And therefore that links in with the notion of jargon as well. Okay, are you noticing the variation in sentence forms and paragraphs as well? Occasionally having like a one-sentence paragraph, very effective. So, jargon has been with us for many a century. A recent study into the language of northeast mining terms unearthed, ouch, some interesting local specialist terms, ... and that it's going to go on now about the mining terms that we looked at in a previous video. Are you getting the hang of this? It should not be written like an essay. It needs to be written like a zippy piece of journalism with lots of linguistic knowledge coming through. Okay, but the key is you've got to know what knowledge you're trying to communicate before you start writing it. Have a lot of fun in writing those, because it's quite a blast actually doing it. But you need lots and lots of practice in doing it. Okay, thanks very much.